She was brand new history teacher to the school and had been preparing her first lesson in her mind for weeks. This was her very first teaching job, and she wanted it to go well. The night before classes began, she couldn't eat and tossed and turned restlessly all night. Up early, she was in her new classroom, sweeping the floor, tidying the desks, and putting up welcome signs just after dawn. Finally, the first bell rang and her very first class came rushing in through the door. They were eager and lively and full of high spirits. She felt her heart lift at the sight of their fresh faces, and soon a lively dialogue between teacher and new students was established. They liked her, she could tell. And they were smart too. She tossed review questions lightly at them to see how much information they'd retained from the previous grade, and they were prompt to answer. And most of the answers were correct. One particular lad, sitting in one of the front desks, was particularly knowledgeable about history. She was impressed by his answers, and more impressed by the fact that he did not push himself forward as the class know-it-all. He answered quickly and quietly, and let others take their turns. He had bright blue eyes and curly dark hair, and his smile was impish. He smiled a lot, soaking in information like a sponge. The teacher smiled at him and tossed out another history question, seemingly at random, which he answered promptly after a pause indicated no one else knew how to respond. At that moment, the bell rang. The teacher smiled as she heard it. Her very first class of her very first day as a teacher had been a success. Then, to her surprise, the curly-haired boy in the front row got up promptly from his seat and hurried toward the door of the classroom without waiting for her to dismiss the class. That seemed strange, after his polite behavior during the class. She opened her mouth to reprimand him and then gasped as he walked straight through the wall beside the door and vanished. The teacher felt her eyes widen and her mouth go dry in shock. Around her, the living students exclaimed in shock and fear. "Did you see?" shrieked one of the girls. "Did you see? He went right through the wall. A ghost." He was a ghost, the boy sitting next to the ghost shouted, banging the desk in his agitation. There was pandemonium in the room for about 5 minutes while the students from the first class exclaimed in excitement and fear while the students filing in for the next class tried to figure out what was going on. The teacher sat on the edge of her desk feeling faint and dizzy. It wasn't until a student brought her a drink of water that she recovered herself enough to dismiss the first class and welcome in the second. The new teacher found out over lunch with her colleagues that the school building had the reputation for being haunted by the ghosts of students who had died too young. Footsteps were heard after hours. Janitors reported the sounds of children talking and laughing inside darkened classrooms, and sometimes felt invisible presences rushing down the empty hallways. But she was the first teacher to see a ghost student in her classroom. The new teacher exited the school after her first day in a thoughtful mood. So, this was teaching. Eager students, belligerent students, funny students, and one ghost. "I wonder what day 2 will bring," she asked aloud, and then shrugged and went home to dinner. It was the night of the new moon, full of glowing stars and a soft summer breeze. He loved nights like this. They were almost luminous. He was walking home from prayer meeting, coming up through the blackberry field. The hiking trail ran right through it, before crossing Spice Creek and then up and over the ridge toward home. The crickets were chirping, and cicadas sang their summer song. He heard tree frogs calling, and a barred owl hooted somewhere close by as crossed the log bridge and headed up the mountain. He had just passed an abandoned missionary Baptist church when the forest grew quiet around him. The cicadas stopped singing, the night creatures went silent, and the breeze died to a whisper. He paused, his heart thudding apprehensively. Why had the night gone so still? Then he heard it. In the quiet, he heard something sliding stealthily through the trees on his right. Something was stalking him. He caught his breath and picked up his pace, hurrying away from whatever it was that lurked in the bushes. A moment later, he heard the soft rustle of leaves as it circled behind him. He could hear the creature moving around him, first in the bushes, then slinking through the leafy underbrush behind him, then rustling the laurels on the other side of the path. The creature was hunting something. He was pretty sure it was him. He moved faster, climbing the steep hill at a trot as the critter drew in closer and closer. He could feel its eyes on him, making the hairs on the back of his neck prickle and his legs shake. It was no longer trying to hide its approach. He could hear the rustling a few paces behind him, growing steadily closer as it wove in and out of the trees on either side of the trail. "Oh Lordy, Lordy," he prayed, quickening his pace until he was almost at a run. When he was a boy, his old granny told him a story about his uncle who'd once been hunted by a panther through the woods above their home. His uncle was sure he was a goner, but at the last minute, he'd turned on the creature and stared it down. He pretended that he was the predator, and the panther was his prey. And it worked. The creature backed away, and his uncle was safe. "You can't show them no fear," his granny said. "Else they'll tear you apart. You remember that, boy. No fear. No fear," he whispered, trying to believe it. He reached the steep part of the trail and started climbing, looking up the dark path toward the place at the top where it was open to the sky and a bit lighter. He kept his eyes on that light bit as he climbed higher and higher. Suddenly, he reached the top of the rise, where the trail leveled off and then entered a dark tunnel of trees. When he stepped inside the tree tunnel, the light vanished completely. His heart started pounding so fast, he thought it would come clean out of his chest. He could sense the creature closing in. It was coming for him. Right here, right now at this very place. He felt in his pockets, but he had no weapon. Not even a pocket knife. There was nothing he could do but go on. So that is what he did. He had to feel his way along the path with his feet. It was so dark on the trail that he might as well be blind. He was right in the middle of the dark tree tunnel when the bushes on his left rustled as something moved through them less than a foot from the path. To heck with it, he thought suddenly. Let's get this over with. Live or die. There's nothing else I can do, he muttered and turned to face the bushes. No fear. He squatted down in the path and put his hands into the dirt directly in front of the place where the creature lurked. A tense moment ticked by. Another. Then something swept onto the path and circled around him, pressing so close that he could feel soft fur against his skin like velvet. The creature took a swipe at his hands, pressed there in the dirt, but it did not use its claws. This was a test, he realized, and slowed his breathing. No fear. No fear. A second circle. A second tap. A third circle. A third tap. He stayed still as a stone while it moved around him, facing the creature down. No fear. No fear. He projected the lie with all his might. He heard a small thud in front of him, as if the creature had sat down on its haunches. He could feel it staring at him, but it was so dark he couldn't even see a reflection from its eyes. The critter seemed baffled by this strange behavior. A moment passed. 2. Then he heard a rustle in the bushes to his left. The creature, whatever it was walking away. It was heading back the way they'd come. He stayed completely still until the crickets started chirping and the cicadas took up their song. It was only then that he was sure that the creature was gone. Sweat poured suddenly down his body, and he collapsed on the path, shaking in terror and relief. If he'd run, it would have torn him to pieces. They chase when you run. But he stood his ground when it slapped his finger, and because he didn't care and wasn't frightened, it backed off. He'd probably never know what it was. A panther? A wild cat? Maybe a yearling bear? It didn't matter. It was gone. He picked himself up off the ground at last and felt his way out of the tunnel of trees. He looked down the long meadow on his right. His cabin gleamed in the starlight, only half a mile away. Praise the Lord and thank you, Granny, he thought. No fear. Then he trotted down the trail toward home.